Good evening. The housing crisis that plagues our city. Where are the affordable houses? What is reasonable rent? And what part does the government have to play in all of this? Tonight my guest is Housing Minister Dr Nick Smith, and Lynched starts right now. Welcome to the show. There is a housing crisis in Christchurch, it's fair to say. Some call it an affordability issue, call it what you like. There are plenty of people out there keen to make a quick buck from disaster victims. Commentators say it's a supply and demand equation, but it's really a supply and old musty dump to desperate citizens make some good cash and demand rip-off prices. But who's at fault? Can we really blame landlords for cashing in on the lack of houses? Is it the insurance companies demanding higher premiums? What are the answers? Well, hopefully to answer some of these questions is Housing Minister Dr Nick Smith. Good morning, or good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Wonderful to be on your program.
Thanks for your time tonight. What do you say to the thousands of Christchurch people facing their fourth winter in practically unlivable homes in Christchurch? There are many of them out there, Doctor.
Yes, there are. And look, the challenges of Christchurch are huge. When you have lost about 15,000 houses from the quakes, when on top of that you've got 90,000 houses that have to be repaired, and some of those people are moving out of those homes, and so they require temporary accommodation while their house is being fixed. And as well as that, you add on to the demand for the reconstruction workforce, you've got incredible demand pressures. And no government can wave the magic wand and take away that hardship and the realism that flows from the earthquakes.
Do we have a housing crisis in Christchurch?
Well, I call it a challenge.
I know you do, and it bugs me. Why call it a challenge? It's a crisis.
Well, look, I understand from the media you want to make things dramatic.
That's the nature of the business. That's unkind. That's unkind. I get emails every day at News Talks ZB with people saying, I'm living in a caravan, I'm living in a damp, musty old home, my rent's just gone up $200 more in the last 6 months. I would call that a crisis.
Well, I look at the official numbers, and if you look, for instance, at rents in Christchurch, they're actually less than what they are in Auckland. If you look at the pace that we're getting around new build, more building permits have been issued for houses in Christchurch in the last 12 months than at any time in this city's history. If you go back to at the time of the earthquakes, there were commentators that were saying, oh, Christchurch's house prices are going to fall through the floor, there's a disaster because I'm losing all my equity. Yes, it is challenging, but I am very confident about the program that we have underway for addressing that, and the reality is that this is what happens when you have New Zealand's worst ever natural disaster.
Is it acceptable, though, that families are still living in cars, families are still living in caravans, because that's their reality?
Well, if I look around, and I've got Housing New Zealand actively out there working, there is the odd person in that situation. But if you look back historically and you say, well, how bad are Housing New Zealand's waiting lists? The people who meet that criteria.
Well, how bad are they?
They are no worse than what they were pre-earthquake. And that's where it's the possible to, and exactly the same if you look at the Christchurch City Council and you look at their waiting lists. Are things more challenging? Yes, I tell you where they are, and that is that the rents have lifted. Why have the rents lifted and the values lifted? We've got house prices in Christchurch over the last 12 months have lifted by 12%, as compared with a national average of 10%. So I don't think we could spend this whole entire program arguing as to whether you should call it a challenge or a crisis. That's not going to get us anywhere. I'm interested in what are the practical things that government needs to do, that councils need to do, that the community needs to do, so that more people are in better housing that's affordable.
I want to pick you up on the data, because the Salvation Army, which by all accounts released quite a decent apolitical data a couple of months ago now, says the city could experience hardship when it comes to housing for 4 to 5 years. That's a long time.
But then replacing a housing stock of 15,000 houses that are destroyed and 90,000 houses that are significantly damaged, that's the reality. And I've got no criticism of the Salvation Army or other organisations who say that's the way. Of course that's the way it is. But then the question is, well, what are the things that you need to be doing about it? And the truth is that the reconstruction is going on in Christchurch at a tremendous pace. Quite a more positive pace than if you look at similar natural disasters. For instance, I don't know whether you saw the report on how they're getting on in North Japan. after their earthquakes. And the truth is that we actually were making substantially greater progress. But I am going to resist anybody that's saying it's hard going. It's the nature of the beast.
But then again, we had a report released recently from a global insurance company that suggested that Christchurch is one of the slowest cities in the world to respond to a natural disaster in terms of housing issues.
Well, let's look through those. The first thing is there is a very unusual feature of Christchurch in respect of its insurance claims. And that is, we have 98% of homes had insurance. You take San Francisco, you take Japan,
right.
You take the major earthquake in Italy, they've only got insurance figures of 30 or 40%. That is a good thing, that we have such a large portion of homes that have insurance. Second element, and look, my background is in geotechnical engineering. Did my own PhD here at the University of Canterbury. The liquefaction that occurred in the Christchurch as a consequence of this earthquake is way beyond the scale of anything that's occurred internationally. And the technical work of which houses should be bowled and which should be fixed is actually a really complex issue. We are developing world-leading technology in this city around how to deal with those unique issues. Some of it, not all of it. I'm not here to defend the insurance companies, but some of the complexity of fixing those houses comes down to those choices around, should we be fixing this and can we make it safe, or should it be bowled? And those questions are not simple.
There's always the argument that there was a 100-day blueprint for the CBD. There wasn't the same blueprint for the residential areas of Christchurch.
Don't accept that.
And the residential areas have been left to waver and wander.
Don't accept that for a moment.
Have you been to the east of Christchurch?
Oh, absolutely, many times. But if you take the land use recovery plan, the equivalent of that city plan is that land use recovery plan. And it sets out how Christchurch and Canterbury, because we must be honest, these issues do go into Waimakariri and also into Selwyn. And if you look at the pace of which the government has moved to rezone land, the main message I get, and this week was meeting, for instance, with Fletcher's, New Zealand's biggest construction company, and their view was that the model that we have used for Christchurch for rapidly zoning areas of land for residential was some of the model that we need to use in other parts of the country. And if you look at the sort of commentators like Hugh Pavovich, who says that the price of your housing is very much linked to the capacity to free up land, and that is why the government's been pretty aggressive.
I want to talk to you later about Hugh Pavovich. I think you make some good points when it comes to releasing more land to make houses more affordable. We'll cover that shortly in the program. We need to take a break. Stay with us. Plenty more with the Housing Minister, Dr. Nick Smith. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest is Dr. Nick Smith. Minister, in terms of the Human Rights Commission, it released a rather damning report on the situation in Christchurch, perhaps predictable, but I want to read you and quote David Rutherford. He says, and I quote, "Many people affected by the earthquakes continue to experience deteriorating standards of living and the impacts on their quality of life that go beyond the immediate effects of the disaster." Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do. Look, there's no doubt that you just need to look at the flood event that we had recently in Christchurch, where you had a compounding situation. The reality is that Christchurch was built in a swamp. The reality is that the drainage systems that were put in previously were not adequate to deal with the land effectively dropping by as much as 300 or 400 millimetres. And if the land is lower, it's more prone to flooding, and so you get the compounding situation of houses that are damaged and cracked, that are releasing and effectively drafty, and then you get a flood on top of that. Look, it does make it tough. Where I think the Human Rights Commission was quite critical of government, and I think they're wrong, is in terms of the criticism the government has taken with properties that are uninsured. And the bit that I don't think they really get is this real problem for government, is that if we are equally generous and say to a person that's not got insurance that we should pay them 100% of the value of their property, you get into a real cultural problem of, well, why should I pay my insurance? And so I disagree with them on that. It's all very well for them to highlight the human concern of the person who, for whatever reason, has not got insurance on their section or their house. But when they argue that they should get 100% compensation as compared with the government's position, that when you're uninsured will only pay half, in my view, you end up into an awful dilemma that you'll send a message right across New Zealand, don't worry about paying your insurance bill because the government's going to bail you out anyway.
But then again, those on bare sections couldn't insure their sections at all, unless they started physically putting a shovel in the ground. That seems a bit unfair, doesn't it?
That's right. Well, but that's the... it is not true.
Insurance.
It's not true to say that you could not get insurance. It is true that EQC only provides insurance for homeowners. So, for instance, if you're a farmer out there and there's a big earthquake and wrecks all your farmland, sorry, there is no EQC coverage for that. EQC was specifically about protecting New Zealanders' interest in their home.
I want to get back to the human rights recommendations, and I guess these are yes or no answers, to be honest with you. Rent controls, good or bad idea?
I think rent controls are unworkable.
Why?
I think, well, the idea that every single week there are over 500 tenancy arrangements entered into in the city, and that you're going to have some bureaucrat calling over it as to whether it's appropriate or not. Why? Because, let's say the house has been dramatically improved, there's been a big investment in it. It might be reasonable for the landlord to ask for more money, an extra bedroom's been put on. The idea that you're going to have bureaucrats setting rents would be a disaster for Christchurch.
Warrant of fitness for all rental properties, surely that's a good idea.
Well, let's just think that through. And I'm doing a lot of technical work. It's a bit like, in the previous government, they had the government deciding what sort of light bulbs you're allowed to have in your house, how much water you're allowed to have in your shower. Be careful what you wish for. So, for instance, around the warrant of fitness for housing, I know, for instance, because we've just run a program of insulating every state house in New Zealand, I'm responsible for 69,000 houses that they have. We know that about 2% of them cannot be insulated. Can't physically. The roofs are too low. So if you're going to compulsorily acquire requirements of that sort, you would be taking thousands of houses out of the marketplace, be able to defer. Hang on. We've got a shortage, not just in Christchurch, in Auckland. Would it be smart?
Well, this is part of Labour's plan, wasn't it? They came out a couple of weeks ago and said that they want this proposal to insulate houses. Is that not a good idea?
Well, as a general rule, and that's why it's a bit ironic.
Sounds good in principle, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, but that's where I say to Labour, they had 69,000 houses owned by the government, 50,000 of them not insulated. We've got stuck in and got them done. But what you've got to be really careful is slogan politics driving public policy. If you say, and this is what Labour and a number of others are proposing, we are going to make it illegal to be able to rent a house unless it meets this insulation standard. The practical reality of that is that there are several tens of thousands of houses that cannot practically be insulated, that you'll be removing from the rental market and making the housing supply rental issue that we must get on top of worse.
Affordable housing, that is such a big issue in Christchurch. You and Jerry Brunley came down to Christchurch recently for some great photo ops and were, digging up the ground and somewhere over in Hornby Way.
Done lots of it. We've got housing developments all over the city, going at pace.
I'll get to those in a minute. Some of those houses, though, you said could go for up to $500,000. With the greatest respect, that doesn't sound like affordable housing to me, Minister.
Well, it's a mix. If you ask me what is affordable housing, I agree with the long-term demographic data, and that is that we should be aiming between 4 and 5 ratios of income to house price.
At the moment, we're sitting at severely unaffordable. You'll know this, with housing at nearly 6 times the annual household earnings.
That's right.
Then how do we get it down to a reasonable 3.0 times?
Well, my view is that you need to be realistic, and I think in the 4 to 5 range is the government's objective.
So how do we do that then? It sounds like a minefield.
Well, if you look at when we first came to office, we commissioned the Productivity Commission. And they set out a very comprehensive study, toured all of New Zealand, heard hundreds of submissions from people in the field, and they've said there's 5 things that government must do to make housing more affordable. Now, these are extra to the sort of things we need to do in Christchurch, specifically to the earthquake. Increase land supply, get the cost of infrastructure down, make building materials more competitive, increase the productivity of the building sector and get those compliance costs down. And we have a program of work on every one of those 5 that is delivering results.
I agree with you when it comes to releasing more land supply, because at the moment we have it is the biggest issue. We have councils around, not just in Christchurch, you'll know this, all over the country that seem to want to restrict the land supply. So then what happens is you get higher prices in the middle. But at the moment it seems this council, and what I'm hearing a lot of talk of, is creating this compact city, higher intensification in the middle. And less need to open up the fringes of Christchurch. Yeah. I say give them that option. If people want to live out in the wop-wops, who are we to say no?
Oh, well, I'm with you. And that is that I think you want to be very careful of your regulatory environment, because what's really gone crook in Auckland particularly, but there are symptoms of it in Christchurch, is that at a high level you get into the slogan politics that says urban sprawl, really bad, must stop it. And then what happens at the neighbourhood level, when they come down to your nice leafy suburbs of Fendleton, and you say that you're going to allow people to build 3-storey compact housing, the local neighbourhood goes crook, you don't get either, and then what you simply end up with is real constraint around housing supply.
You see, the council would probably argue, you've heard this before, the reason why they won't open up more land is, we don't have the money to pay for the infrastructure. Why not make the developers pay for it if they're so
Well,
keen to
they
move out there?
They do, but that's one of the other issues of which we've got a bill right now before Parliament, is that if you look at the price of a house and you compare it either with Australia or you compare it with New Zealand historically, it is the price of the section where prices are completely out of hand. In other words, it's the increase in the section price, not the building. There are some sensible things that we need to do to get smarter about how we build the building, get better price materials, those things, yes. But the big gains is in the section, and the big gains in the section is around more sensible regulatory approach, increasing supply, and in terms of those infrastructure costs, of which councils have been hitting developers too hard with those levies that have driven up and impacted on section prices.
Here's a question I want to ask you from Facebook. How many emergency or backup accommodation exactly has the government or the council, in your view, provided or made available to date that are available right now to help with the housing issue in this city?
About 400.
So are you comfortable that's enough?
Well, if you look at, and let me talk about the different things that we are doing. Number one is those temporary accommodation villages. So we've got 3 that were built on reserves. I opened a 4th last year at Rangers Park, and I've been quite open about the fact that my immediate top priority is expanding the amount of temporary accommodation. This is where you've got a family whose house is sufficiently badly damaged, they've got to go move somewhere else short term. I have seen rents in the city where people are paying as much as $700-800 a week to try and fill that gap. This is getting harder because in the early stage of the repairs, they were very focused on the smaller repairs in the house. They're now getting into that cycle of doing the really big repairs where people may have to be absent from their long-term home for 3 or 4 months. And that is why we've got the temporary accommodation service providing those. In addition to that, and this is where I say, look, if you're looking for a single magic bullet, there ain't one. You've got to do a whole lot of stuff. So we've got those temporary accommodation villages and the service that goes with it. As well as that, we're expanding the community housing sector, going for broke. Today I've announced a further block of 75 units across Christchurch, where whether it is the Housing Trust, whether it's Abbeyfield, whether it's these community organisations that say, hey, look, if the government provided us with some money, we can be part of the solution. Now I get criticism that says, oh, but they're not owned by the government. I say, well, look, the people in them don't give us toss. If the government has provided funding to help community organisations increase supply of housing that's helping people out, that's a good thing.
We need to take a break. There's so much to discuss. I want to discuss the greedy landlord issue in Christchurch. That's next. Stay with us. You're watching Lynched on CTV. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest is Housing Minister Dr Nick Smith. Minister, greedy landlords. There is a perception out there in Christchurch, for better or worse, we've got a lot of greedy landlords in the city that are quick to make, a bit of cash from disaster victims. We are living in extraordinary times in Christchurch. That calls for extraordinary measures, doesn't it?
It does, and that is why, for instance, the government has changed land use planning laws with arbitrary reference, going at a huge pace. That is why the government's spending close on $1 billion around its state housing stock. That is why I'm in discussions with your council.
It's not even a matter of state housing stock, though. It's people on middle incomes. It's people that are even above the working income that can't even afford to live in their own homes these days, Minister.
Everybody can define the problem. The hard part is defining the solution. So when people rave on to me about greedy landlords, I say to them, well, I don't have a whole lot of people putting their hand up in Christchurch and saying, hey, me, I'm a greedy landlord, do they?
No.
So how are you going to identify the landlords that we need to increase the supply of housing?
Trade me lately?
Well, they are expensive.
It's shocking. It is shocking.
Well, what's going on in Christchurch is that you have got a shortage of housing supply, and as a consequence, prices go up. The difficulty is that if you come along then and artificially regulate, and you say, oh, well, you can't charge those rents, then you're not going to get the new investment and those extra 15,000, 20,000 houses that the city needs. Well, it's a simple market response. Why is there a record number of building permits being issued in Christchurch in the last year? It's because people are wanting to invest in the city. I take you back. 2009, people were saying Christchurch house prices were going to collapse. They've done the opposite.
Well, then we had an earthquake, didn't we? But have we got enough? We don't have enough housing stock now. Is the government working fast enough? Or are we going to continue to say, well, the reason why we haven't been able to build new homes because we're still going through earthquake events 3 years after the fact?
Sure, no. The 2 parts I would point to, if you look at the government, we are building a new house every single day. We are investing over $1 billion directly in terms of the housing that we are building.
I was going to ask you about that. Are you actually building one house a day in Christchurch? Because you said that last year. That sounds too good to be true.
Well, 700 over, we will have 700 new houses.
You got the photos?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take you for a
seriously,
stroll.
are you honestly building one state house or one house a day in Christchurch? Where are they? I'll go check them out.
Come out with me and see them.
To be honest with you, it sounds too good to be true, though.
Well, actually, it's not enough. If you look at the number of building permits that are being issued by our council.
Where are these one houses a day the government's building?
Well, I could take you all over happy to give you the addresses.
Let's have a tour of Christchurch, because I can't find them.
We'd be happy to oblige. But if you look at the council's own building figures provided by Statistics New Zealand, more houses permitted to be built in Christchurch in the last year than any year in the history of the city. The pleas I'm getting, and I think it's self-evident, is that when you've got complaints about shortage of apprentices, when I've got a community like mine in Nelson, where all our builders and subbies have been sucked out now down working in Christchurch, it is blatantly plain that there is a heap of building activity going on in the city.
Minister, could the Christchurch City Council be doing more? Are you happy with their response thus far of the disaster, of the housing crisis?
Yeah, well, quite clearly the government is not comfortable with the issue of building consents and the bureaucracy that goes around that. There is no question that
they're getting better, though, aren't they?
Yeah, my view is that we've put a commissioner in there, and Doug is doing a very good job of getting that building consent department sorted out, so that we are getting good quality standards. We want to rebuild a good city, but we need to do it fast.
Well, I want to pick you up on something. A Sumner property owner abandoned plans to build 2 apartments after being hit with a $72,000 fee from the Christchurch City Council. The owner was really interested in investing, more money. We're not talking a whole block, we're talking 2 apartment buildings, but he said they want a contribution fee.
You sure he's not one of those greedy landlords you're talking about before?
Quite possibly. But seriously, $72,000.
You're right on the money.
Why would he bother? He's not bothering now. So isn't it the council's responsibility to take some restriction off and say, hey, there is a housing crisis, we'll give you some incentives to build? At the moment, it seems like in some parts...
This is a really important point. I asked you to give me the chance to answer it properly. If we look over the last 10 years, not just in Christchurch but New Zealand-wide, what part of total building costs have gone up by more than the other? Answer: development contributions, the levy that councils charge developers and builders. There's been an attitude, not just in Christchurch but New Zealand-wide, and that is that whatever cost we dump on the developer, somehow that's not passed on. It is. It adds to the unaffordability issue. That's why this government has got a bill right before Parliament right now which does 2 very important things with the very issue that you highlight in Sumner. That is, legislatively restrict what councils can charge for those development contributions, and secondly, introduce an independent appeal system so that, of course, the council wants as much money as it can get. It's short of dosh. The developer wants to pay as little as possible. He's a capitalist, he wants to make money. And you need to have an independent party determining what is a fair level of charge for the infrastructure to service those new apartments or those new houses. And that is a law that will be in place by July.
Good. I'm glad you said that. That's my next question. When is this coming in? I want to talk to you about apprentices. As you alluded to before, we do have a shortage of tradies in the city. Yeah. I mean, that's a given. Shouldn't we be looking at trying to house people in Christchurch first before potentially bringing in thousands of rebuild workers to fix the CBD?
Well, you need both.
Of course we need both, but at the moment, should we be living in a society at the moment where everyday residents are competing for residential houses from foreigners or workers coming to the city? I mean, I know there's a fine balancing act.
No, but the idea that you can artificially, and governments or councils can somehow say, oh, well, you can't rent that house because you're an overseas person that's come to town. You need to be realistic about what works and what you can and cannot regulate. For instance, when I jump on the plane on a Monday morning and fly from Nelson to Christchurch, it's a plane full of builders, of surveyors, of people that are coming down here to rebuild the infrastructure in the houses. And you can't have it both ways. You can't in one breath say that when you get on and get the houses repaired, get the infrastructure repaired, build those new houses, but the next minute, actually, we don't want the people in town that are actually going to be able to deliver the goods. My
final question, we've only got 30 seconds left, Minister. What do you say to people in their 4th winter that are living in a cold, damp, basically unlivable home? What is your message to them?
My message to them is you want a government and a council that is focused at pace on repairing and replacing the houses of Christchurch as quickly as possible, and that is what's occurring.
Housing Minister Dr Nick Smith, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in to the program today. That is our show this week. We're out of time. We'll see you next week.